What attracts you to the airline side of the business?
Masochism.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavon of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who is our unwitting guest today?
Or have the pleasure of speaking with Jochen Schnatt, also known as Jock. So Jock is currently CEO for Fly4 Airlines. But prior to that, he was, so he's got a pretty extensive resume, so bear with me here. But he was Principal Managing Director for Latitude Aviation. He was also VP Aviation Business Management for Dubai Airports. Also Managing Director and CCO for FlyBMI. Prior to that, he was Director White Label Programs for Flybe. He's also Commercial Director for Monarch Airlines, Strategy and Business Manager for Aer Lingus, Market Development Director for AWAS. He was the CEO and founder of CPA. The COO for JetMagic, EATCO and Ops Expert for Eurocontrol. He's had various roles, non-executive roles with SMBC, Bristol Airport, Stobart Air, Belfast City Airport, BA City Flyer, and Virgin Nigeria. He graduated from the University of York with a degree in airport management and planning, and he also has an MSc in air transportation management from Cranfield University. So, tremendous experience from the airline side, but also dabbling with airports, dabbling with leasing companies. So it's going to be a pretty good discussion, I think. So in any case, Johan, this is your time on wing.
Just a quick intermission before we continue with the show. We do get a lot of questions about how our listeners can support the show, and frankly, the easiest way is to continue the spirit of the show, which is just to reach out to us at conferences. But we also run businesses as well, and you can support us by supporting a lot of the work that we do. You can support the work that I do through Visual Approach by visiting visualapproach.io, where we produce a lot of research and analysis, a lot of data visualizations.
From my side, obviously, I focus more on metals, so anything that's aircraft related, if you're looking for valuations, whether it's on aircraft engines, I'm happy to help with any of those types of projects. So we appreciate certainly the opportunities to work with all of you. And we certainly also appreciate just the fact that people are willing to listen to what we have to say and enjoy kind of our thoughts and takes on what we think is a fascinating industry. So thank you.
Okay, back to the show.
Well, so Jock, thank you very much for being on with us today. It's a real pleasure to have you on. And as we do with all of our other guests, the one of the things that we really love to hear about is kind of how you got your start in aviation. You've got quite a list of things that you've done in your career. But it'd be great to hear kind of like where did the passion come from? You seem to have been involved in aviation for pretty much all of your career. So we'd love to kind of get your take on, where did that passion come from? How did it get started, and how do you get to where you are today?
Sure. Well, Garrick, I go one step further. It's not just all my career; it's probably almost all of my life, because the passion got ignited when I was age 6, and I used to go with my dad to Vienna Airport on Saturdays. They had at the time one of those open terraces that you could actually stand outside and actually overlook the apron and everything. And it was pretty much then, that the bug bit, and I got infected with, basically making up my mind saying, this is what I want to do. As most 6-year-olds in that generation would have probably said, I want to become a pilot. And that was actually my fascination. I never veered from that, until age 18, when I went for it. But unfortunately didn't get through the selection process, because believe it or not, back then, in the days of MD-80s and Fokker 50s, which were the standard equipment in Austrian Airlines, they actually had a height limit of 193 centimeters. And my official measurement at the time from my, basically going for the selection process for the armed forces was 194.6. So on that basis, I actually didn't get through the selection process, which is,
wow.
in today's world, unthinkable, but back then, that's what it was. So that stopped me initially in my tracks.
Wow. So you were too tall.
Too tall.
Wow. That's fascinating. I've never heard that before, but wow, that's crazy.
I haven't. Yeah. Were you looking to go into the military or even commercial?
Yeah. So both actually. I mean, the military is a different story because there is this measurement from your knee to your hips. And the unfortunate thing is if your legs are too long, like mine would have been, in case of an ejection, your legs would stay inside the cockpit, which is not that great.
Yeah, so, but that's on you, right? Can't you decide?
Well,
I'm willing to forego the bottom half of my legs for the opportunity to fly.
I mean, that's a good point, right? It's like, well, we like to keep you whole. So
they did offer me to look at helicopters, but strangely enough, choppers never did it for me. So I was never that interested in terms of going into rotary. I can't explain why. It just never really sort of fascinated me that much. So I passed it on that and resigned to the fact that I won't be flying fast jets.
Yes, well, we just finished a conversation with a rotary pilot, Michael Hallaby, if you know him. He's with MUFG.
Yeah.
And he's never flown fixed wing, so this is interesting kind of dynamic. I will point out, though, that one of the greatest aces of all time, I believe his first name was Douglas Bader.
Yeah.
Flew Hurricanes during the war. He had no legs.
Yeah, you're right.
And he was shot down over France, I think, and the Germans literally allowed the British to parachute his legs in. But so there you go. See, you don't need. He didn't lose them in the crash, right? He was without them. And had prosthetics, right? And that's how he controlled the airplane. So
I will never forget this when we started JetMagic, which was a sort of small regional airline flying Embraer 135s and 145s in Cork. One of the guys we got like an Aussie, great pilot, great character, the kind of pilot that you want to have in your airline. And none of us actually ever noticed, right? I happened to share my apartment actually with him, so we were, as he would put it in an Australian accent, roomies. Uh-huh. But it was like almost bizarre, there was a bit of a plonking noise, when he was walking on the floor above. Mm-hmm. None of us actually knew it, but he had a prosthetic leg and he was perfectly fine to fly, It was just at some point in time we found out but that was actually the case, but it's no problem,
So you were too tall, for the flight deck. Yeah, here you are. So
what happened?
Yes. So what happened?
Yeah,
I mean, without jumping ahead in terms of where we might actually get to, it was actually a life lesson taught very early. Because when that happened, this is now 18 years old, 12 years, basically convinced that I will be a pilot, and there was nothing else, there was no alternative. And then being stopped in the tracks was a bit of a hard pill to swallow. So I was a bit of a loss initially in thinking, what could I do? What next? I was considering just going to university in Vienna, or actually in Austria. And then I sort of I remembered from the time I spent always on aviation, about Eurocontrol. And Austria just became a member to Eurocontrol, a year prior to that. And it was for the first time that they actually opened the pathway for becoming an ab initio controller, to Austrian nationals as well. And, I researched air traffic control a bit more, thought it was actually quite cool, knew that it was actually reasonably well remunerated, and thought, you know what, give this a shot, do it, and then do your pilot licenses privately. And once you have the licenses, no airline is actually going to turn it down anymore because, It's a much cheaper way of getting actually qualified pilots. So that was my motivation. I applied. For whatever reason, still beyond my understanding, I actually got through with the German space and aerospace agency DLR, and started my training in 1993 as a controller. That took me 3.5 years, and I stayed with that. And actually, while I did this, there came a point where I actually realized that I kind of enjoy air traffic control. And I actually, at the same time, lost my interest in becoming a professional pilot. There were bits and pieces that I just, became further aware of it.
Is it because you were talking to him all day and you didn't?
Well,
listen, in full transparency, I am a former pilot.
Right.
So I flew for the airlines for 5 years, and I'm recovering.
I think there was an element of that, but I think the bigger thing, in all seriousness, was more in terms of the daily routine of a commercial pilot, and it's actually also the reason why I didn't stay an air traffic control and ATCO. You look at most people who did this, they would have actually stayed certainly within Eurocontrol and retired in air traffic control. But the one thing I realized actually reasonably soon into my air traffic control career was saying that while I enjoy this at the moment, I cannot see myself doing this for the next 30 years, and then calling it a day. I kind of need the challenge of doing new things. And then sort of the thinking began in terms of how do you move from what is essentially a very safe working environment, well paid, to a place where I can maintain sort of a certain standard of living, but move on to greater or crazier or whatever way you want to put it, things in life. And that's when I then decided to save up my leave, do my degrees in parallel to being an ATCO. So to give me a springboard to actually go into other parts of the industry, into management roles. And, that's essentially what happened. So for the very reason that I decided not to become a pilot, I equally decided that air traffic control, while fun at that part of my life, at that point in my life, was not going to be what I was going to be doing until the end of my career.
So how did so from that, once you received your degree, is that when you looked at JetMagic? Was that the transition, or was that what was in between that, if there was anything in between that?
Well, there was actually not anything in between, Garrick. It was actually a drunk night at university.
All the best stories start out.
The best stories.
That's right.
No, what essentially happened was one of the guys I was studying with, he came across an opportunity to basically start a regional airline out of Ireland. Initially, the focus was on Shannon. We discussed it. We then felt Cork, as the second largest city, is actually a better place. This is in the days when the Celtic Tiger, as it was referred to, was roaring. The world couldn't be big enough. And it was clearly underserved. And I'm saying clearly underserved because ultimately everything that JetMagic actually did ultimately sort of kind of survived and continued to be served. So we actually clearly demonstrated that the market potential was there. And pretty much towards the end of us doing our degree, it was a drunk and late night at university. And we sort of asked ourselves the question in terms of saying, so if we believe there's an opportunity, why would we not run with it? And why would we not see if we can actually raise the finance? And sure enough, we did give it a try. And within 8 months from that day, the capital was raised and we started JetMagic in the spring of 2003. It didn't last the test of time, unfortunately. Number of reasons. I don't think the business plan was wrong per se. It was undercapitalized like a lot of startups are. And I think the one thing, if the 51-year-old Jock would be talking to the then 30-year-old Jock again, would say, number one, if you have convinced yourself that the number is X don't allow yourself to be negotiated down to X minus. Stick with what you have actually believed in. And advice number 2 would be, what we should have actually done is, I guess, bury the the juvenile ego and actually sit down with the flag carrier, in that case Aer Lingus, and say, look, is there actually something there whereby we can provide a service for you out of the region that can be complementary to what you're doing? We focus on the smaller jets that you're not operating, and therefore come up with a formula where 1 + 1 = 3, rather than trying to headbutt yourself against the incumbent national flag carrier, which is deeply ingrained and embedded in Irish society. So I think that's the one thing I would actually say, where we probably underestimated the challenges we would face going up against the embedded flag carrier.
Was it so in the competitive kind of the underestimation that you talk about? Was it an underestimation of the response? So the numbers worked until they felt the need to respond, or was it just more the time frame involved?
I think there were a couple of things, Courtney. I think number 1, Aer Lingus neglected Cork at the time, right? And the senior management at the time had no interest. They only saw Dublin. But the middle management actually below that, there were people there, and one of them became one of my very great friends, and who ultimately was CEO in Aer Lingus, Stephen Kavanagh. He actually saw this very much as a weak spot for somebody else to actually go into their backyard and do something. So the response, when we actually started the market and the planes were filling, finally people like Stephen actually got some more voice within Aer Lingus, and that enabled them to respond. So I think there was that element. And the second one is where I go back to what I said beforehand about, if we convinced ourselves that we needed X as a startup capital, then don't go with X minus. Yeah. I think the challenge for us was that the investment or the investor portfolio at the time were people who were very successful businessmen, but they were very successful businessmen in real estate. There was very little experience and understanding of the aviation space, and therefore there was an expectation, a bit sort of rose-tinted glasses in terms of, we are Cork, Cork needs to have its own airline, blah, blah, blah. When the reality hit home in terms of the economics of this, their appetite to put more capital in to allow us to actually get to critical mass, to expand into other markets. And at the time we were looking mainly at Belfast City and London City, which both in their independent independent sort of roles have actually proven that they can actually support localized airlines. So again, the logic was actually not wrong, but we didn't have the means to actually become that essentially home carrier for those other markets as well. If that would have happened, who knows, right? It may not be called JetMagic anymore. In all likelihood, it would have been gazumped by somebody called British Airways or Aer Lingus or one of the bigger carriers. But what was JetMagic, I believe could have still been around.
You mentioned this, but what was the fleet type or fleet types?
It was Embraer 135s and 145s. So this was prior to the launch of the E-Jet. And at the time, we were actually in discussions together with Crossair to be one of the launch customers for the 170 and 190, both of which were designed with steep approach capability in mind and London City certification, which was a key focus on what we were actually looking to do.
That's I find that fascinating, especially since that was kind of the era when I was on the flight deck as well.
And the interesting thing, actually, I should have added this. Believe it or not, JetMagic was essentially a small regional airline, right? So of no significance whatsoever. but we actually were the airline that got the 135 and the corporate jet version of it, which is the legacy, certified for steep approach into London City. So Embraer was closely working with us. And in terms of if I ever was to look at putting down my autobiography or something, this is actually one experience I will never forget when, as part of the certification process, one Saturday morning we had to fly into London City and shoot some approaches in there with all of our senior training captains. And I had the opportunity to go with them for the day. And doing this, it was just an unbelievable experience coming in with a high performance aircraft into essentially a tiny strip in the center of London, you know.
Yeah, that's very cool. So it feels like, you know, when I look at kind of the different jobs that you've had, right? It seems like you're, even though you've done different things on the leasing side, you've worked for, you know, airports, but you always seem to go back to the airline side. So what attracts you to the airline side of the business, right? Because you seem to kind of keep coming back to it. So what's driving that interest from your side?
Masochism.
A truer answer has never been given on this podcast.
Look, I think it's an incredibly fascinating and in equal measures frustrating part of the industry, right? I mean, it's in terms of sheer pace, in terms of multidimensional chess games, in terms of buzz, in terms of the characters that it attracts, it is pretty unique. And for that reason, I probably always felt closest in my heart and in my head at home in the airline space. But I do appreciate and I do value the opportunities I had in my career to go into other parts of the industry as well. Be that leasing, you mentioned already, Garrick, and airports, air traffic control, obviously, where it's all started. And even a lot of consultancy work I've done under my own steam, essentially. I think the opportunity to do so many different things in different parts of the industry has been, I feel extremely lucky and fortunate that I had that opportunity, because what it has allowed me to do is build a very comprehensive and holistic understanding of the industry, and I wouldn't want to miss that ever. But my true passion and heart lies in the airline space, and it's, as I said, it's just the sheer pace of it, the fact that guaranteed no 2 days will ever be the same. You know, the cyclicality of it, the multidimensional chess game that it is truly fascinating, and that's why I probably keep coming back for more. But a healthy dose of masochism, no doubt, is also part of it.
Yeah.
There's a saying, airlines are where the rubber leaves the road.
Yeah.
And that's so true in aviation, right? I mean, it all comes down to the airlines. Look, it's not the most profitable sector of the industry, but it's probably the most exciting.
I think you're absolutely right, Court, on that. But, you know, you just made a really interesting point, which is, you know, it's not the most profitable part of the industry. And when you think that statement through, then it is equally the most frustrating part of the airline industry to actually have allowed ourselves to get into a space where so much control over the customer, over the distribution, over the inventory, over the supply chain has actually been surrendered to suppliers who are happily making very high double-digit margins when the airline industry, at the best of times, is sort of peaking out at high single-digit margins at an industry level. And within that, there's, you know, some very profitable players out there, but a long tail of mediocre or substandard, or when you talk about return on capital, players actually out there. So that is, and for me, always has been the most frustrating part of the airline industry, that so much control has actually been surrendered to suppliers to the industry, and whether they're called airports or aircraft leasing companies or distribution companies, is just incomprehensible when you really think about it.
Yeah. Well, it's always amazed me because when you look at kind of the food chain of the industry, right? It starts at the top. You guys are, the airlines are at the top, and it basically trickles down to everybody else, right? And everybody else feeds off of whatever the airlines are doing, because at the end of the day, an airline touches every single part of aviation, whether it be, like you said, the leasing side, the banking side, the MRO side, the manufacturing part, you name it, right? It's just, it's all there. And yet that's the part of the industry that seems to have huge swings in terms of, you can do really well. You can also do really poorly in a bad environment just because the cost is so huge. It's just fascinating to me.
Yeah. I think a lot of that is based on, the one thing is certainly that control has been surrendered, in terms of key parts of the value chain, and the customer journey. But I think the other thing is that, the people you need to actually operate an airline, highly skilled, labor, where training costs a huge amount of money, takes multiple years, as a result of which you have a very strong, workforce that is on top of that actually very well organized in many parts of the world. And therefore maintaining that cost, effectively has always been a challenge. And the other thing is, of course, it is probably still the most glamorous, if you want to use that word, part of the industry, because ultimately people want to go somewhere. No one gets on a plane because they want to sit on a plane. I mean, there's a few anorex around probably.
Yeah.
And usually they're very often wearing white vests, which conveniently close at the back. But the very vast majority of people sit on a plane either because they want to go somewhere or they have to go somewhere. So this is where it all starts. And then, the mistakes that have been made over decades to actually allow or hand over control over certain parts of the customer journey have actually gotten us in a position where in some areas, co-distribution, aircraft financing, or actually simply flying to certain airports have made the airline industry quite weak from a negotiation point of view.
It's that glamour too that has kind of lowercase g glamour.
Yeah.
We talked about the supply chain, but the glamorous nature of running an airline increases the supply of crazy people. I don't know a better way to put that. Right? There's always... So if you look at an airline business case and you say, it's not strong enough, I don't think I'm going to jump into it, I guarantee you somebody will.
Yeah.
There's always somebody that's going to do it, and they're going to lose their shirt. And then they'll do it again.
I think you're absolutely right, Court. I mean, the amount of business cases that have been funded that should have never seen a single dollar is unbelievable, right? And which is why one of the reasons why you have such a high failure rate, amongst other reasons, of course. But the thing is, when you actually think this through, and you look at it in a regional context of how the airline industry is performing, take the US now, or North America, which has been basically a recycling of Chapter 11 all the time, right? Up until probably the last 10 years. And that consolidation...
Could be starting again.
Well, to some extent, but the consolidation or the degree of consolidation in North America is unprecedented, right? So what you have on the back of that is a much greater capacity discipline than when I compare this to Europe, right? Consolidation is picking up pace now a bit, but there's still way too many players around. And as a result of that, we never had that capacity discipline that would have actually allowed for the capacity to be deployed in a more profitable and more sensible and more sustainable from a financial perspective manner.
I think that's a point that does not get discussed enough. I just had a conversation with somebody, mentioned North America, and since that's where we Garrick and I are. It's what we think about. But of course, Spirit Airlines is going through their challenges kind of most recently. And I think somebody put out a research report that said that they think that Spirit can reduce their fleet to a point where bankruptcy can be averted. They can kind of shrink, not necessarily to profitability. What gets missed, and what I think has been missed in this specific report, is it ignores the moment you take a flight out of a market, somebody jumps right back in, and you're at net zero without all that revenue, right? If as long as there's somebody to backfill that frequency, we've seen it. I mean, at Atlanta, the world's busiest airport, we've seen this for years, where Delta would de-peak a hub, and AirTran at the time would be like, okay, we'll take them. So they're stuck with the same operational constraints. It's just they don't control them now. And that prevents... So you have intelligent beings. I mean, still aviation people, as we all are, but still mostly intelligent, making these decisions. And it takes one time before you realize, oh, wait a minute, if I pull something back, my competitor is just going to take it. And I'm going to be... So I can't pull it back. Right? That's where that capacity discipline just flies out the window. It's not analytical. I get asked this all the time. Can you forecast this? No, it's game theory. Right? They're playing chess. They're playing three-dimensional chess.
I think you're touching on something really, really interesting here. I would be the first person to admit that network planning has been very, very lazy and fundamentally has not evolved over the last sort of 30, 40 years. Sure, there's been improvements and everything, but it is, to a very large extent, a statistical exercise and one based on previous experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I will say is, and when you look at, certainly in my lifetime, the single biggest event that has changed this industry, it's called COVID, right? Because we as people and society have fundamentally changed in the way we work, in the way we engage, in the way we do a lot of things. So when you have a complete reshuffling of the deck, and some people will probably disagree with me on this. I know there's a lot of people out there, especially in the industry, that will say everything will be exactly the same. It's just a matter of time. Things are bouncing back. And there is some evidence to suggest that business travel, maybe, or corporate travel may be getting closer to where it used to be. I think the US is slightly different than in Europe for a number of reasons. Personally, I don't buy that argument at all, because I think we have had a fundamental change in how we actually behave and live our daily lives. So when you have a cataclysmic event such as COVID, to then actually go back and looking at historic data to predict what the future will bring, and therefore what the demand is, I think is completely outdated. And when I look at the application of AI and real-time consumer sentiment in many other businesses, in particular, just look at e-commerce. I think the airline industry has probably been a victim of being a first mover in terms of automation, right? I think we were right there at the forefront of it in the 70s and 80s. But I don't think we have fundamentally evolved that much. And other industries have actually outperformed the airline industry in many ways, in terms of, particularly when it comes to e-commerce. So I think until such a time that we can find an effective way that we can measure, gauge, and act on consumer sentiment in real time, and therefore radically think or rethink how we do network planning, I think we will have suboptimal outcomes.
I mean, just network planning is very close to my heart. In my other life, not the Garrick version, but in the other version of my life, I spent a lot of time on the network planning side with airlines, with Brett Snyder doing the Cranky Network Weekly and that. And look, some of the smartest people I know in aviation are in network planning. They're using tools and optimizers that are old but not ineffective. But what gets missed And by the way, I think AI actually furthers the misconception and actually pushes them further the wrong direction. Is that what gets missed between network planners, between revenue management analysts and teams, is that they are playing chess against another person. If you optimize strictly to what the computer says, the irrational player on the other side is going to screw that all up. O'Leary has proven this. Baldanza has proven this. Southwest originally proved this. Richard Branson has proven this. Right? It takes somebody playing chess amongst a game of checkers to blow it all up. To your point, it blew up during COVID. So going back and trying to play the game the same way is, we have to relearn the game, and by and large, it's a human game, right? We're playing against one another.
But it's really a fascinating story, and I'll give you a real life example of this. When I headed up the commercial function in Fly BMI, we had a very close relationship with partnership with Lufthansa, whereby out of Munich, out of Frankfurt, with our Embraer 145s, which is in the 2015, 16, 17, 18 timeframe, a very difficult aircraft, a 50-seater jet to make money with, right? Well, this was a massive challenge, but at least back then and pre-COVID, we still had solid corporate traffic. So we had this conversation about a market, northeastern German city called Rostock, which is on the Baltic Sea. And I think Lufthansa tried to operate it like sort of, 3 times a week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, with regional equipment or sub 100 gauge equipment, and could never make it work, right? And somebody suggested this to me, and then I wasn't sure about it, and I actually went out I'd never been to Rostock beforehand. So I went on a fact-finding mission there. And there were a couple of really startling insights. Number one, it's got the single biggest Air Force base for the main fighter aircraft that the German Air Force has, the Eurofighter or Typhoon, which is being built in Munich. Sixt, which is one of the biggest car rental companies in the world these days, headquartered in Munich, but their whole administration was actually in Rostock. So 800 people. So Sixt would have actually used their corporate jets sometimes twice a day to fly people up and down between Rostock and Munich. A lot of the offshore wind turbine industry was actually based up there. So just spending a few days, one of a major pharmaceutical company had actually a big production plant up there, but headquarters was in Zurich. So when I spent those 3 days there, I got myself to a place where all of a sudden I start realizing, saying, hang on a second, there is some real organic traffic between those two places. And surely if you put the service on, you should be able to capture that. And you need to put this in the context of the 2 nearest airports, major airports, were Berlin, which is a 2 hours drive on a good day, and Hamburg, which is 2.5 hours on a good day. And when you look at the PDUs, as those very intelligent people in network planning like to look at, you would have said, where's the traffic between Rostock and Munich? And it would never work, right? But based on that research, we then decided, okay, let's start with a 6 times a week evening service between those 2 cities. Within, I think, 6 weeks, we hit a load factor of in the high 70%.
Wow.
And a very healthy yield. Within a year thereafter, we went to double daily, and the load factor and the yield stayed exactly the same, right? And we had this conversation subsequently with, Lufthansa as a partner, saying, where's all this traffic coming from? And the fact is the traffic was always there. It just never showed as a Rostock-Munich traffic because it flew from Hamburg or Berlin. And these are the fundamental flaws of network planning to the present day, where we're looking at data and assuming the catchment area is actually sitting within the perimeter fence of airport A and in the perimeter fence of airport B. And of course, we all know that that's not the truth, right? So you need to understand the true sentiment, the true requirement, the true location and the true source and destination of where the traffic is going to really understand that picture. And I don't think even to the present day, network planning has actually matured to that level to fully understand that picture and therefore make some of those decisions maybe in a different way.
So it's interesting you mentioned that. This is something that I've personally looked into very closely over the past couple of years, is really kind of leveraging the latest that we have in terms of cell phone mobility data. Mm-hmm. And not to look at who's flying, but to look at who's driving.
Yep.
Who's going to an airport from where? What airports are they ignoring that are closer? What airports are they driving around? Who's just driving the whole distance? Which part of the city is pulling to which airports? It's only been the last year or two I started working with airlines on that. Now more of the airlines are pulling this in-house as this becomes available. But you're right. My career started off, and it's when I was a pilot, so I wasn't working in network planning at this point, but with Comair Airlines, which was a Delta carrier. Now, they were a prorate carrier at the time. They're now, they're now nothing, but they moved to a CPA, more traditional ACMI. And they were prorate, extremely profitable. And I sat with the vice president of network planning at the time, just as I was in my graduate program. And I said, how'd you do it? Thinking, I'm doing, in fact, at the time, this is 2005 or 2006, I'm writing a paper on artificial intelligence to forecast market demand for markets. He says, the way we did it, we just went to the airports. We just sat in the cities for a couple of days and just looked to see what happened. He said he would go to the Chamber of Commerce, which is kind of the local kind of business group, and he would ask a very specific question. He would ask, how many hotel rooms do you have in the city? And he would compare hotel rooms to seats. Mm-hmm. And then there's a population component as well. And either you're coming to visit family, which would be a population component, or you're visiting, which would be a hotel room component. If there are too many hotel rooms, guess what? They will discount the crap out of those hotel rooms to fill them up.
Yeah.
That means more seats, right? That means more passengers. And I thought it was the most genius approach because in its simplicity, he said you have to go and see. You have to sit in the airport, see who's getting on airplanes, see where they're going. And that's really stuck with me. Over all this time, it's very similar to the story you told of Rostock, right? You have to align. You have to really understand why it is that people are flying in that city. Garrick Garrick is sitting right in one of the more interesting areas near New Haven, Connecticut, right now. Mm-hmm. Right here is an airport that could not sustain regional service. I want to say maybe 2 -8s a day. It ended up becoming 50-seat jets as the -8s went away. Just enough to maintain service. And there's a low-cost airline called Avelo said, I think we're going to put 737 700s and 800s in there. And they're killing it out of New Haven. They're absolutely killing it. I think Garrick has personally funded half of that airline with his own travel.
I'm sure Andrew Levy would be very thankful for Garrick's business,
Yeah.
Are you elite status yet, Garrick?
Not yet. No. Although, it's funny because now you have Breeze that's kind of caught on to that. And I think it...
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think it coincided with the fact that I think then Avail all of a sudden started going, well, we can also maybe fly out of Hartford. And Breeze went, well, that's our airport. Maybe we can fly to New Haven. Hey, look at that. So, but... Good for the consumer, right?
It's the reasons to go, as you mentioned already. And it's the other thing in terms of what's actually the demographic in the catchment area. So Connecticut is, probably, I don't know the exact details, but it will be probably in the upper X% of disposable income in the US.
Just look at the models behind them, John.
Yeah, well, there you go. Somebody has to pay for that. But the thing is, so you have to, and ultimately it's a convenience play, right? Because I go back to the Rostock example. It's not that people want to fly from Berlin or to Hamburg, But because they actually couldn't fly there on a direct flight, other than on, flying out for the weekend to the Baltic Sea, or otherwise commute for the week to Munich that way, if they wanted to come home the next day, the only way to do it is going via another airport. So the schedule that was provided was not fit for purpose for what actually the market needed. And when you address that, then you actually unlock a potential that will not be on any PTU statistic that you can actually get from MIDT or any of the other sources. You won't find that. So your example of going to ground and understanding the market and what's driving it is key. My only caveat, and my only sort of contradicting myself partially in this, is it's one thing to fill a 50 or 70 seater regional jet that way. It's a completely different story if you want to fill a 190 or 200 seater 737-800 or a MAX 8 or an A320-21, then you will have to have some additional traffic, which is probably more of the discretionary category, which is typically lower yield as well.
But if you think about how business plans, I get this question all the time, what's the next disruptive business plan in the airlines? And I said, look, if I knew that, I'd be doing it. But if you look back at the disruption, right? We had the legacy system back in the 70s and 80s. And then, you had, and there were other airlines that were doing this before, but Southwest kind of is the lasting version of the low cost system. Then you had Ryanair took that to another level, right? Really with ancillary fees, the ultra low cost, we had to give it a term. I have to throw in Allegiant and what they did with give me the oldest, cheapest aircraft. It can burn as much fuel and maintenance, I don't care, but it never leaves the ground if it's not making money, right? That was disruptive. It's just a completely new way to think about the airlines.
I think the Allegiant one is a really interesting example because what Maury and the original gang have actually done is they have taken the variable cost element of an airline to a new extreme, right?
Right.
And I think that element to say our fixed cost base is so low that we can be perfectly happy to sit on the ground and do nothing when there's simply no profitable way of flying, and we only fly when we can actually make money. I'm over exaggerating, of course. But in essence, that's what the business model was all about. And I think that was the pure genius of actually converting so much of your cost base into the variable cost to say, okay, on a comparative level, I may pay more for fuel, for engine maintenance, or, for maintenance costs, for landing, for whatever. But I do that when I actually can generate sufficient revenue that I can make a healthy profit on that way. It's basically, and that's the pure genius of that business model.
Yep. Yeah. If it doesn't make money, it doesn't fly.
No.
And it costs very little. I mean, you're paying so little on those airplanes, probably, whatever a strip of pavement in Vegas, for an MD-80 at the time cost, which couldn't have been too high. I don't think the airline does much of anything on Tuesdays. Same on Wednesdays, right? We before we started recording, we kind of talked about how this relates to kind of lease rates and ACMI rates as well. But like I say, it's an American term, but the cat's out of the bag. Yeah. We know, like the Allegiant was disruptive, just like Southwest was, just like Ryanair was. I mean, there's a whole list of them, but they're now known, right? So now you have the second and third players coming in and using that business model. Same thing on the operating lease side, the ACMI lease side. You were talking about, look, there's more demand than supply right now. The problem is that everybody knows it. So leases are through the roof. So to get more lift, is going to be very expensive, and you're going to be bidding against a lot of players. The cat's out of the bag.
Yep.
It's a weird cliche, actually. It's a weird colloquialism, come to think of it. It's a cat in a bag, and anyway.
But I think you mentioned Southwest as the granddaddy of low cost, right? And then along came, there were several copycats in the US, People Express and, Hooters and all sorts of airlines actually out there who in some way, shape or form tried to copy it, And then was this highly unprofitable, almost bankrupt family outfit in Ireland. In comes an understudy of Herb Kelleher, looked at this, copy-pasted some of the key fundamentals, but he took it to a completely new level, right? And he has supersized this now to an extent where they're single-handedly the most profitable airline in the industry, right? So, first mover advantage has always great advantages for sure, but that's not to say that you can't actually take bits and pieces and actually improve them and then come up with something else. And if I look at what I'm doing at the moment with Fly4, ACMI is not a new concept. There's plenty of players out there. In fact, there's a very large group out there going for global domination, right? And we'll be interested to see how that's going to play out for them. But what that equally has shown us is that it creates actually demand for a somewhat differentiated proposition. And this is where, from our perspective in terms of Fly4, where we believe there's actually a market niche that could be very attractive. It may not be hundreds of aircraft, but it doesn't have to be. You need to have critical mass for sure. We all know that. But I think we are, I mentioned this before, and COVID has been the single biggest catalyst change in the industry, certainly in my lifetime. And I firmly believe that we have not seen the full structural change, the seismic shift that has actually started. I don't think we have seen the end of that. I think there's still new trends emerging in terms of consumer behavior, in terms of the thinking how we need to actually produce capacity, etc. So I do believe that that change that is actually in motion at the moment will create all sorts of opportunities for the right kind of business. And today I can sit back from a Fly4 perspective and say, well, because of our shareholding, we have 2 anchor customers already, which is great because it means that we have a clear sales pipeline for the foreseeable future, just between shareholder customers. But I can equally take a look in terms of saying, right, so the well-documented supply chain issues in the industry are omnipresent, and they're probably not subsiding for the next 2 or 3 years. Now, one could say, okay, once the OEMs get this under control and maybe throw in a crisis or 2, that will sort itself out. But I think the next sort of development stage is already on the horizon, because on the back of, hyper demand or pent up demand, we have seen an incredible surge in revenue again, in particular on account of yields, right? That has actually propelled us or the industry to good levels of profitability. But personally, I don't think they're sustainable. And all the while, cost increases that have actually gone into the industry. When I look at some of the pay deals that have been accepted, how is that going to be sustainable, right? So you can see a situation where costs have actually gone up very significantly now against the revenue picture, which is probably ebbing off. I don't want to say necessarily decline, but certainly the yield element is going to come down. And then we are not even talking about any of the ESG stuff that is coming and how we're going to fund that. And you look at this in terms of saying, so what's going to change now to get us actually to a place where we can be sustainable, profitable again? So this is where I look in terms of our case now. I'm saying, today it's called supply chain. Tomorrow it's going to be called something else. But provided you're actually positioned yourself, and you have a relevant product to sell, then I think you can be, even though we're not the first, we're not even the second, we can be very successful in our own market.
The cost equation is really interesting. And I do definitely want to hear more about Fly4 and what you guys are doing. But your comment about revenues and so yields went through the roof. In the US, we kind of saw this exaggerated because we had a self-inflicted pilot shortage in there as well. But you saw, a shortage in capacity. Yields went through the roof. But what everybody missed, and they wouldn't have missed if they were subscribers to the Aircraft Intelligence Monthly, right, Garrick?
That's right, Courtney.
Was that watch high yields, because it incentivizes airlines to do whatever they can at whatever cost to chase those yields. And then they go away.
Yeah.
Or they revert to normal. It's not that they go away, they revert to normal. Voila, the last 3 years in the United States. Right. And now we're on the back side of that curve. Europe, I think, is 9 to 12 months behind, just because the US was able to they had the money and the means to push so much capacity into the system. There's not that much capacity left for Europe to do it. Southeast Asia is kind of another 12 months behind, but we all do the same things, right? I mean, it's a very human approach.
Look, I think you would be a very brave man to be the revenue manager or the chief revenue officer in an airline saying, "Oh, we won't do this," when we can actually maximize our revenues when everybody else does it, because we don't think pushing through 40% yield increases is sustainable and or unethical. You wouldn't be in your job for a very long time.
Right.
Let's face it. But the thing is, and I've always said this, unless everybody turned a millionaire except myself during COVID, and I've just missed it, I can't understand how that sort of pricing level is going to hold up against that very high level of demand. And now we're getting to a situation where reality starts hitting home because all the other bills have actually gone up. And let's face it, holidays are great. We all want them. We all need them. But in terms of the hierarchy of needs, it's probably not something that is on the top of the list, as opposed to having a roof over your head, feeding yourself, sending kids to school, etc., etc. So I think that's where the reality is hitting home now, and the party is going to come to an end. I think the advantage that you have in North America, and we go back to what we discussed beforehand, is that you have a far more consolidated market and therefore much greater capacity discipline than we have in Europe. Because we don't have the capacity discipline, we will see a prolonged struggle, and then we're probably going to see a more sobering adjustment process happening in terms of what's going to happen in the market there.
Yeah, I'd love to go back to something that you talked about, which touch on kind of ESG a little bit, and so especially when you look at Fly4 Airlines, the aircraft type that you're flying today. How do you guys look at transitioning over the longer term into something that's going to meet ESG guidelines, the big push in terms of the pressures? How do you look at that, knowing today's the next generation airplane today don't perform as they should, right? So how do you kind of look at that to figure out this is kind of the road, the path that we need to take to get to where we need to be 10 years from now? What's the process? I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, it's a good question, Garrick. I mean, I'll probably give you a slightly flippant answer on this. We obviously in year one of our existence, right? Because of the customer portfolio that we have a very clear picture of what summer looks like. What we don't know yet is what the steady state year-round Fly4 business model looks like. Ideally, we will replicate in the winter what we're doing in the summer, maybe in different geographies. Ideally, we will sign up some longer-term, maybe year-round agreements with other airlines. Ideally, we may actually just find ourselves in a situation where we do, charter as well as ACMI, and have that kind of income stream against, ad hoc business and zero charters, etc. But today, here in September 2024, in our first year of existence, I couldn't tell you yet what the year-round steady state income model looks like per aircraft in Fly4. We have some ideas, we have some thoughts. But until such time that we know this, the incentive for us to look at a piece of kit that on paper is 15% more fuel efficient, but in terms of overall economics, very marginally an improvement, because when I look at engine maintenance costs and other factors here, that advantage in fuel cost is very quickly eaten up. And on top of that, I've actually, coming back to the conversation we had about Allegiant beforehand, the genius of Allegiant was that they have managed to maximize their variable cost base and minimize their fixed cost base. So for us, the incentive to actually have an even higher fixed cost base than we have right now is just not there. And when you look at the ACMI or capacity market, whether we actually offer a max to a customer or an 800 NG, a 12, 13-year-old NG, we're not getting a single dime more in terms of block hour rates or lease rates. So until such point in time where that is changing and there's a differentiated pricing model for newer equipment because the customer airline is actually requiring that to meet their ESG targets, it's really not something that is at the forefront of our minds. And I think we need to prove to ourselves first what the year-round business model looks like. If we get to a point where we are properly confident and comfortable that our winter business is, X% of our summer business, and therefore we can justify the investment in newer technology, until such point in time, we will probably sit on the fence a bit, as is being said over here, and watch the space and see how we can actually optimize it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I'll since Courtney's been doing most of the talking like he always does, I'll throw out another question. When you think, so there's about 20-year difference between when you started JetMagic and then obviously starting Fly4 Airlines. So within that 20-year period, I guess what have been some of the biggest differences that you've seen in terms of starting an airline?
Wow, good question. I think the single biggest difference is I was 20 years younger and had a lot more energy, and had a lot more hair as well. But all joking aside, I think the single biggest difference is the regulatory environment is a very different one than when we started JetMagic 20 years ago. EASA didn't exist back then, or was just about to take over from the national regulators. And the level of regulatory compliance you need to fulfill now to actually get certified and actually run a compliant airline with good safety standards is, a multiple of that what it was 20 years ago. That was for me the single biggest takeaway going through this now over the last sort of, we did it in 9 months, right? I mean, we pushed the button on the 1st of July. Obviously greatly benefiting from the fact that both our shareholders are existing operators of 737s in their own right, and therefore we could piggyback on a lot of expertise, a lot of experience, a lot of database, etc., a lot of data. But nevertheless, getting to that finishing point by early March and getting our AOC, it was a much harder process than it was 20 years ago when we set up JetMagic. So that's definitely a major change. I think certainly the industry is more. I've been talking about consolidation quite a bit. It was far more fragmented than it was 20 years ago. It's even in Europe, it's not as fragmented anymore. I think there's definitely a different level of integration there now. But for me, the single biggest thing would have been the whole regulatory framework, and what it takes to actually get going.
Along those lines, I was getting the sweats. I wasn't talking enough, Gary. It's stressing me out. Along those lines, here we are 20 years later, Fly4 Airlines, ACMI, both wet and damp, and we were having the conversations about exactly what the definition of damp is. I know the way you define it is the airline brings their own cabin crew in the damp lease. But in that business model, which frankly is one that we haven't looked at very closely, we tend to deal more with operational lessors, the dry lessors. Where does that business as a model stand today? And really the question I'm driving to here is what keeps you up at night? Like, what are the big challenges you're always trying to resolve when it comes to being an ACMI carrier?
Good questions. I think number one, I think pre-COVID, and I'm talking now mainly from a European context, but pre-COVID, ACMI was pretty much a tactical tool, a get me out of jail card. I'm in trouble, call 1-800, can I have an airplane, please? Kind of setup. Today, post-COVID, there's virtually no airline grouping that is not using wet lease in some way, shape, or form, in a more strategic way. I think, again, North America has always been very different. I tried to actually start Fly4 Mark 1 back in 2006, albeit in the regional space, trying to bring the North American capacity purchase agreement model to Europe. And we saw this on the back of JetMagic as an opportunity to go into the Lufthansas and the other big players in Europe and saying, look, guys, why don't you hand that sort of small gauge flying over to us? We can focus on this. We can do it probably far more cost efficient than you can. We keep this sort of, clear separation. You're not part of the ownership. And the fact that we managed to raise finance and support from back then the two biggest players in North America, being ExpressJet and subsequent SkyWest, was for me testament to the fact that we had actually a very solid business idea. The problem was we tried this between 2005 and 2009. We got very close on numerous occasions, but I don't think the market was quite ready. So I think I was ahead of my time. And it's interesting now because I think in a European context, ACMI has become far more mainstream. It has become far more strategic. A lot of airlines are looking at this as either an answer to seasonal peak demand, like our shareholders, either looking at it as a opportunity to, develop and experiment in new markets without actually having to commit to the metal and everything that goes with it yourself, in a lower risk way. So there's multiple different applications, right? And I think what's really interesting now is that the CPA model, more like as it's known in North America, seems to be actually finally getting some traction in Europe as well. So there's very recently, a number of deals have been announced, which are multi-year kind of agreements. And I think there's a growing realization that certainly by some of the big players that certain segments of the market doesn't make sense for them to do themselves, or not fully themselves, and use somebody else who is actually focused on this, who can do it in a far more cost efficient way, and create that sort of flexibility. And sometimes the motivation can be simply, a balance sheet relief. It can be the examples I mentioned before. And so to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I think we have moved from an afterthought tactical solution, get me out of jail kind of thinking, to how can I actually use this in an intelligent way to actually make my overall capacity deployment more flexible, more cost efficient, more profitable, and actually tap into markets in a more agile way than I could have done otherwise.
Which is definitely more in the direction of that CPA style,
yes.
Right? More strategic, long term.
100%.
And that's the hardest part with the CPA. I agree, you were probably too early. I think a lot of people don't understand about the CPA business is it is entirely binary. There are only maybe 4 or 5 real customers because they're the big airlines.
Yep.
Big enough that they would have a network that into which this new fleet would incorporate. And for any number of reasons, they may not even be good reasons. They may just say no. Right? And they're only a small handful. But when they do, they're big, right?
I think that the interesting thing is when I reflect on where we were, in 2005, 2006, 2007, when we launched this, in the boardroom discussions we would have been at with, prospect customers, the understanding wasn't there that the longevity of agreements is a essential part of the equation, so that the regional player can go away with the strength of the commercial agreement to actually then source the aircraft at the right price and finance them at attractive costs and assume the tail risk to be in a place whereby you can provide cost-efficient capacity back to the customer. That understanding wasn't there. And it was the brand ego in terms of saying, oh, we wouldn't do this. And our tail fin flying in somebody else's operation for 10 years or whatever is something unthinkable in those numbers. So I think there was a lack of appreciation of what's required to make that model successful. But you see it now more and more in terms of saying, well, actually, we can't do this cost effectively, but yet we actually want that feed or that market coverage. And therefore, we need to find a solution how we can do it. And I think that sort of thinking is slowly gathering pace now, saying, yeah, if we want this for our own markets and for our own P&L, then we probably need to think slightly differently, and maybe we need to come up with some new structures and new tools.
You said the key term is tail risk. That is the difference between a CPA
100%.
and on the opposite end is the ACMI. Now, look, it's always kind of there. In a CPA, you're going to get a better deal, customer, large airline, because you're taking away the tail risk. It's still, if on an ACMI, you're paying for it, and then my margin on top of it. So the shorter term contract is there to handle that tail risk, right? You're just paying more for it.
100%. And here's the other thing, and this is one of the not the learnings, I would say, but the realizations and certainly the validations I've seen over the last 7 months, year since we are doing Fly4. For us to be able to attract talent from a workforce perspective, it's a very different proposition if we are highly opportunistic, hand to mouth, doing this today, that tomorrow, and then see what we end up with. If, however, we are in a position to think longer term ahead in terms of multiple years and also in terms of number of tails, and therefore we can think of things like roster patterns. We can think of terms and conditions of employment that are slightly different than some of the hardcore ACMI players, then you will be in a position to attract different talent. And again, in terms of looking at the service delivery, which has to be on time, every time, dependable, quality, clean cabins, crew that speak the language, etc., 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 you are playing in a very different game than the very opportunistic market of saying here today, there tomorrow,
So, obviously, my focus is mainly I look at the equipment, I look at aircraft, right? And so the comments that both of you made in terms of CPAs and you're seeing traction kind of in Europe and kind of that growing. What do you think the impact is of the fact that so typically when I think of CPAs, I think more smaller gauge aircraft, but we seem to be moving in a direction where there's fewer choices for airlines to buy new airplanes, right? I mean, if you think about kind of what's available today, you've got the ATR, which is at the slightly bigger gauge, unless you count the ATR 42. And then you've got, kind of Embraer that's out there, but also bigger gauge airplanes, Airbus, bigger gauge airplanes. So from that standpoint, right, what, does that have the ability to derail any traction that's going on, because all of a sudden you're running out of smaller gauge airplanes that would typically be used for that type of agreement? Or might not think about this correctly?
No, I think you're spot on, Garrick. I think there's one other driver though, and this is bringing me back to COVID, right? In the pre-COVID world, like and I'm sure there's tons of markets like this in North America as well, but I would look at some of the secondary and tertiary places in Europe, right? They would have been easily able to support 3, sometimes 4 frequencies a day from those secondary, tertiary places into the major hubs like Frankfurt, like Munich, like Zurich, like London to a lesser extent, because Heathrow was never a hub that had a lot of small gauge aircraft, simply because it was congested and simply because it's the single biggest O&D market in the world, right? But the Paris is the Amsterdam's good example, right? And that was possible because you had those very strong corporate traffic flows on the Monday out, back on the Friday. You needed that flexibility because you were going to go for your day meeting and come back the same day. And people were happily parting with $700-800 for a return ticket, to do so. Now, I believe that market, I'm not saying it's gone, but it's not the same size as it used to be beforehand. Because one of the things that has happened is that we have realized that actually Teams and Co. actually does work. And while you wouldn't do this to sign a contract with a new client, or while you wouldn't do this to actually grow your business, certainly the after sales, the key account management type of stuff, you wouldn't sit on a plane all the time anymore and spend $800 in the process. But I think we as individuals have also changed, right? Our ability and our willingness to get up at 4 o'clock to catch a 6 o'clock flight, to fly out, come back in the afternoon, and potentially do the same over again the next day, or at least one more time that week, is not there anymore. On top of that, we might have actually moved further away from where we work because, there is no need to be in the office on a daily basis. So, you can work from home maybe 2, maybe 3 days a week. And therefore, those patterns will have changed. So to your point about the small gauge aircraft, I think the main challenge is that the number of markets that would have been able to support the high yields that you need on those small gauge aircraft, and therefore drive that sort of 3 or 4 daily frequencies, even from tertiary markets into major hubs, I don't think that market is there anymore. And a classic example is in the UK. There was a regional airline which at one stage was actually almost 80 aircraft called Flybe. And it was mainly UK focused, but also served sort of the immediate neighborhood of the UK, like Benelux, France, etc. And that market is gone. Some of it you can upgauge for sure. I mean, Lufthansa at one stage took a view of saying they're going to get rid of a large number of their small gauge aircraft and put everything on a 320 gauge. And that works to certain markets, but I come back to the Rostock example. Some of these markets, if you cut down the frequency and it's no longer convenient to go, you just wouldn't travel anymore because it is inconvenient actually doing that business, and you'd rather go on a Teams call. Because why would I actually do that and then pay for a hotel room or 2 because I actually can't get, efficiently back. So I think consumer behavior has changed, the market has changed, and I think that has an impact now in terms of where we're going in this sort of small gauge market now. And, better than anybody really, one of the artificial limiting factors for the gauge and CPAs has always been scope close. And that hasn't gone away either.
Yeah. That's a great point.
US,
yeah, no, absolutely.
In the ACMI business, we've talked about kind of seasonality, the cyclicality of the market. Certainly in the US here, we're starting to see higher peaks, not by day of week, but more by season, and lower troughs, kind of deeper valleys. Is seasonality? Do you see seasonality as an opportunity to, a better opportunity to deploy the excess capacity during the high seasons, or do you see it more as a risk for the deeper valleys during the low seasons?
I think at the moment it's probably a bigger risk than an opportunity. Clearly, I come back again to your cost base. How much of your cost base can you turn into a variable? The more variable you can do, the better positioned you are, no question. The one thing I will say is, and this is maybe controversial,
Write this down, Gary.
We like that.
I think we have seen, even before COVID maybe already, but certainly since COVID, a pushing of the peak season more and more into the shoulders, right? And there's probably a number of reasons for that. One is basically an aging population, demographics in many European countries where the empty nesters or the, people with disposable income, they can go any time of the year. So why go in the peak season when everybody else goes, or the families go, etc. But here's a really interesting thing. Climate change, right? We have now a situation in Europe now and maybe it's just become made more aware to us because of the omnipresence of social media and media in general, and the dramatization of anything and everything that happens, right? But now we have open debates starting in many European countries whether summer holidays for the kids should be shortened and more holidays should be moved out into the shoulders, just because of the sheer heat, right? And I think if that's going to happen, what you will see is that demand that is now very focused between, let's say, May and September, potentially all of a sudden kicking off as early as March and pushing out into October, November. So I think therein lies another one of those changing factors that can significantly impact on the way we look at the business model. But the fundamental at the moment in 2024, I would still say it's more of a risk than an opportunity. And the more you can do in terms of variable cost base, or the more the bigger portion of your cost base you can move into variable, the better positioned you will be to actually cope with it.
We're seeing the shift of, the shrinkage of the summer months in the U.S. as well. My kids went back to school August 7th, which, if you're asking me, was wonderful, right?
Yeah, you live in Texas, though. Come on.
Yeah, but I don't. Yeah, let them go somewhere else. I could use some peace and quiet. But they're getting more. So now during U.S. Thanksgiving, it's pretty common. The schools have a week-long break. It's become one of the major holidays here in the U.S., at least in this region. It's my favorite. It's the best time to go do anything. The weather's great. There's now this. If you think of how big of a travel event spring break is, or March break, and then you just move that week and duplicate it in the fall, right? We're starting to see that as well. Now there's still seasonality on either side of it, ups and downs. It maybe, I guess, in the long term, or moreover from a month perspective, it smooths it out a little bit. But still, I mean, you're parking airplanes on Tuesdays regardless. The time between Thanksgiving and 2 weeks before Christmas is dead.
And you see, there's one other thing which I find really fascinating, and this is it's very anecdotal. I don't have the data in front of me, so I can't intelligently...
Just make it up. That's what we do.
In fact, there's very few things I can talk intelligently about. But the one thing I will say is, when I think back sort of 5-10 years, right, a major network carrier like Lufthansa or Air France, you would have not seen them going to some places that would be considered hardcore leisure destination, or even like very remote, Now you see things popping up like northern Norway, where, there are small catchment areas, and they would be served by the mainline airline 3-4 times a week, right? And I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's something that has happened in these places that now create these sort of unique city pairs now. But I think, again, coming out of COVID, I think people are looking at, well, let's go beyond the tried and tested. Let's try something new. And again, maybe it is climate change. Maybe people are saying, you know what, I have no longer any interest to go to a place where it might be 40, 45 degrees heat in the summer. I actually prefer 20, 25 and a cooler climate, So I think there is a lot of things, and this is where I go back to what I said earlier. COVID has definitely been a catalyst in terms of driving seismic shift in the industry. I don't believe we have seen the end of what the tectonic plates are still moving. They haven't settled yet. And there will be still new dynamics and new drivers, and new, dynamics and drivers coming out of this, and which we haven't fully understood yet.
I have to say, this is the first time we've talked to any guest who has ever even come close to suggesting that northern Norway markets are sun markets.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
That's great.
It's I mean, it's fascinating. You know, the not northern Norway market, but no, I mean, you talk about, you made the comment before about, you know, with COVID, all of a sudden it became that much tougher to forecast anything. Just imagine as we progress forward, right? As we move forward, and if all of a sudden things change where people kind of go, hey, you know what? We don't have to travel in the summer. I prefer to go. Now all of a sudden try to forecast that going forward. I mean, although I think lessors would love that, because now all of a sudden they can have the discussion of, yeah, we have airplanes available after September. You know, we don't all have our airplanes available, you know, starting in May or June or April, you know, through August, right? Which is, I think, the discussion that you probably have all the time to go, if you have an airplane, then I'll take it. Be after the summer,
not so sure.
Yeah, you know what? We'll talk after the summer, right? Yeah. So that would definitely change things. That's to me is fascinating that, you know, you're seeing that trend, and that, yeah, I think it does change a lot of things and how you view the industry. And it's amazing to me the impacts of social media when it comes to creating destinations that people then go to, right?
Just think about it. Like, if you would have told anybody 10 years ago that you can actually make a very good living out of filming yourself, strutting off some gear, talking about the experience that you're having, and being sponsored by others to actually act as a, you know, in the Middle Ages, they would have called them rat catchers, you know. It's just unbelievable, right? That job is something that did not exist before. And yeah, we had, you know, travel magazines and things like that, and Lonely Planet, and of course you could, you know, create an interest, and in a way, when you think about, like, Emirates, you know, they have really become a global brand on the back of investing very heavily in major sports events all over the world, in all sort of key sports, and you actually create awareness that way. So I think we're in a very different ballgame now than where we were beforehand, but demand can be generated. People do think and look for new things. I think, you know, there's a generational shift in mindset in terms of what people are looking for, and what the value chain is compared to maybe our generation and the generation beforehand. So there's a lot of things. And you know, you asked me before in terms of how come I gravitated towards the airline industry time and again. You know, one of the other things I actually should have mentioned, and which I always find fascinating, is that despite all the headaches and the challenges, the adaptability of the industry is just unbelievable, right? When you think about all the major crises that have been thrown at it, and the industry being always, well, very often at the forefront of coping with these changes, the adaptability has just been phenomenal. And that's a testament to, I guess, the kind of people that are involved in the industry, and why it is actually attractive to be part of it.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, we're still here talking about airplanes after traffic was down 97% or whatever it was in May of 2020. So somebody did something right or less bad. Doesn't matter. Both count.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting point, Court, because you look at this, and of course, with very few exceptions, called Ryanair and maybe one or two others, the industry would have been wiped out if governments didn't step in a very big way. But the fact that they did step in actually tells you everything you need to know in terms of how important this industry has become for the global economy, in so many different shapes, and not just tourism, you know, in terms of how many jobs are actually depending on it directly and indirectly. So something must be right about it, you know?
Yeah. And yet, this is something that we talked about with the previous guest a little bit, you know, and yet, the aviation is criticized so much for carbon emissions and, you know, for being, you know, kind of at the forefront of not doing enough, you know, to be able to be more environmentally friendly. But, you know, I think it's the point that you just made. I think people don't realize how impactful the industry is from a global standpoint, right? I mean, and the fact that it touches so many different parts of any industry as well as people, and it's just, everybody just focuses on, but look, these airplanes, you see them, there's stuff coming out of the engines, it's bad, we're definitely an industry that I think thrives to improve year over year. It may not be as fast as people want, but at the end of the day, we're still going in that direction. And because of aviation, I think, the global economies have done what they've done, right? It's a big part of that, but people don't realize that.
I think the high profile nature of the industry has always made it a target in terms of saying, oh, surely there must be money there because all these rich folk are flying. So I think that has always been something. I think the industry as a whole has done a pretty lousy job in terms of telling its story. We've always been actually defending ourselves as a victim rather than actually putting the record straight on key issues. The fact that there's hundreds of thousands of people having no problem buying a 5 or 6 liter V8 pickup truck when there's absolutely no need for it, and driving around it, that no one's talking about that. Well, why is that? So I think from a PR perspective, we have not done the best of jobs to actually really shape the narrative, and we have been too comfortable playing a reactive game rather than proactively going out there and dealing with the facts and the wider macroeconomic drivers that the industry is actually providing,
And we just went through a period. I mean, if the argument is, hey, look, you're not considering the benefits of travel, you're only looking at, the negatives and the CO2, which again is a very small percentage of global CO2. But still, if you're not looking at the benefits and considering the benefits, well, we just had COVID where those all went away.
Yep.
They all went away. And the moment they came back, the people came back. Right? I mean, that's part of those fluctuations, the tidal shift that you've been talking about. We're still in it. We probably will be. I think you said, 5 to 7? I'll say 10. I think we're going to be able to find something that was a fluctuation of COVID for probably the majority of the remainder of our careers, until we have something else
to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly that.
That's the one thing about aviation, right? There's always something to talk about because it's always exciting, right? You never know what's going to happen next, good or bad, right? And you have to take 100%. The good with the bad. So yeah, absolutely. So, but Jock, look, we've kept you on long enough. This has been tremendous.
Great.
Really enjoyed hearing about all your experiences and getting your thoughts on what's going on. So we want to thank you for taking time to speak with us today. Hopefully you had fun as well. This is always something that we look forward to. So thank you very much.
Yeah, look, guys, thanks very much for the invitation. I had a ball. It was really, really good fun, and some. You don't get the chance every day at 9 o'clock at night to actually come up with, or try to come up with some semi-intelligent discussions. But it was actually truly fun talking to you guys. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Jock. Let's get ready to.
You're not ready.
Podcast.
You're not ready. Come on. Let's get excited. Come on. Let's get excited. It's a good podcast. Come on. Let's get excited. Oh, I gotta change my internet provider. Problem is, we have one alternative, which is Frontier, which is now going to be Verizon.
Is Verizon buying Frontier?
They're buying certain things from Frontier.
Was JetBlue not interested?
Nice.
Kind of proud of that one.
Yeah.